God of War. The Legend of Alexander the Great. Part 1. The Golden Boy of Conquest. In the year 334 BC, a 20-year-old named Alexander, king of the small nation of Macedonia, embarked on one of the greatest, or rather, most insane military road trips in history. His target? The superpower of the age, the Persian Empire. Just 20 years old, his brilliant and fearless leadership won him battle after battle. And in an astonishing 10-year campaign that took him to the edge of the known world, he carved out one of the largest empires ever known. Few men have had such a massive impact on the course of history. To the Persians, he was Alexander the Accursed, a rather dramatic title. But to the West, he was immortalized under the stage name Alexander the Great. Our story begins in ancient Greece. From around 500 BC, this rugged land was the scene of remarkable developments in art, philosophy, and of course the art of skewering one another. Its two greatest city-states were Athens, a naval power where democracy, art, drama, and philosophy flourished, and Sparta, an austere, militaristic society, famed for its formidable army where breakfast was probably more brutal than most battles. In 480 BC, these two rivals, who normally couldn't stand each other, teamed up to fight an invasion by the mighty Persian Empire. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force, led by 300 legendary Spartans, held up the enormous Persian army for 3 days before they were finally encircled and killed. Then, in the Straits of Salamis, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy. But they couldn't prevent the Persians from burning the sacred temples of the Athenian Acropolis, an act the Greeks carefully noted down in their book of grudges for future retaliation. The next year, at Plataea, the Greeks won a decisive land battle against the Persians and forced them to abandon their invasion. The next 50 years were the golden age of classical Greece, but rising tension between Athens and Sparta, two egos too big for one peninsula, eventually led to war, dragging the Greek world into decades of destructive fighting. Wars between the Greek city-states continued for almost a century, leaving them exhausted and vulnerable to a new, rising power to the north. For centuries, sophisticated Greeks had viewed the mountainous kingdom of Macedonia as a backwater, Hicksville, barely Greek at all. But under King Philip II, that Hicksville emerged as a formidable military force. His most famous reform, the introduction of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, twice the length of a normal Greek spear, and wielded by trained infantry fighting in close formation, known as a phalanx. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the joint forces of Thebes and Athens. Through alliance and conquest, Philip had already gained control over most of his neighbors. Now, following this victory, he united all Greece in an alliance known as the Hellenic League, or League of Corinth, with Philip as hegemon, or supreme commander. Only Sparta, in its typical stubborn fashion, stood aside. Philip began to plan a great campaign, a pan-Hellenic, or all-Greek, war against the Persian Empire. Their old foe was now an ailing superpower, its great riches ripe for the taking. But on the eve of launching his war, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard, a victim of Macedonia's brutal court rivalries. He was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, brilliant, restless, tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle, and already an experienced military commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia. But first he had to secure his own position as king. At home, he had potential rivals executed, then crushed rebellions in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece. He made a special example of Thebes, completely destroying the ancient city and selling its people into slavery. In the spring of 334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Alexander's Orchestra of Destruction. Alexander's army was about 40,000 strong, drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry were commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. In the front rank, 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and drilled, who formed up for battle in the phalanx, 16 ranks deep. This packed formation presented a solid wall of iron spear tips and was virtually unstoppable. But it was also difficult to maneuver and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks or rear. So 3,000 elite infantry, the hypaspists, or shield-bearers, armed with shorter spears, guarded its flanks. They were commanded by Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The second line of Alexander's army was made up of 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries, armed as hoplites. They took their name from the hoplon, their large, round shield, and carried shorter, 8-foot spears. A hoplite phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, but still well-armed and heavily armored for the time. The Agriones were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. Other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria were armed with javelins, slings, and bows. The shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen armed with spear and sword, commanded by Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander led the royal squadron in person. There were also 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, commanded by Callis, 600 from other parts of Greece, led by Arigius, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, under Cassander. The Granicus, a bloody debut. The great Persian Empire was divided into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now threatened by Alexander's invasion, met to discuss strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged them to avoid battle with Alexander. Instead, he advised them to use a scorched earth strategy, to burn villages and crops and withdraw to the interior. Alexander's army, he promised, would quickly starve. It was good advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces without a fight. So, they decided to face Alexander's army at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about 10,000 horsemen from across the empire. Behind, in reserve, were the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies at this time. These men fought for Persian gold and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks, and so placed them at the rear. Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. Ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault. Calling on his men to show their courage, he then led his right wing across the river. As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts, and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders were stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses and men against men, the Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank, the Persians determined to prevent them crossing and to push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless, but he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river, including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx. Then, suddenly, Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by two Persian nobles. Rohaces rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then, from behind, Spithridates raised his sword against the king, but Black Cletus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all. Now the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the battle. Alexander, in a blood rage, or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred. Alexander had won a great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy, but the Persian Empire was still a land of immense wealth and power. Already it was mobilizing its vast resources to face him. If Alexander was to conquer this empire and take his place in history, he'd next have to face Darius, King of Kings, himself. Issus and Gaugamela. King Darius III, the king of running away. Alexander continued his march. At Gordium he was shown the legendary Gordian Knot. A prophecy said that whoever could unpick it would rule all Asia. Alexander simply took his sword and sliced it in half. A very practical solution. 18 months into the invasion, Alexander led his men into Cilicia. But then the main Persian army, led by King Darius III himself, emerged behind the Greek army. Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered almost 2-1. He blocked Alexander's only escape route by moving his army to the coastal plain near Issus, just 6 miles wide from mountains to sea. The narrow battlefield would force Alexander to fight, but it also prevented Darius from exploiting his huge numerical advantage. His army, by some estimates, was up to 100,000 strong and contained some of the finest soldiers in his vast empire, including 10,000 of his own household troops, known as the Immortals. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind a small river, the Pinaris, and waited for Alexander to attack. He didn't have to wait long. Alexander once again personally led the charge. But in the center of the battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx was in trouble. In its effort to keep up with Alexander, its formation had become disordered. Now, in fierce fighting with Darius's Greek mercenaries, the phalanx was slowly being driven back. Alexander, seeing the danger, regrouped and led the companions in a headlong charge straight at the Persian center. He fought his way towards the great king, Darius himself. Rather than face this apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king, Darius fled the battlefield in his royal chariot. As the news that Darius had fled spread among his troops, they abandoned the fight and tried to save themselves. The battle turned into a massacre. Ptolemy, one of the Macedonian commanders, told Alexander there were so many Persian dead, his men had used them to fill a deep ravine so they could cross over it. The Battle of Issus was a stunning victory for Alexander, and amongst the spoils of victory were Darius's wife, mother, and 3 children, all taken alive and well treated by Alexander. He continued, subduing the Phoenician coastal cities, ending Persian naval power in the Mediterranean. But the island city of Tyre resisted. Tyre's defenders fought bravely and skillfully, even when Alexander began building a causeway to the island. But after 7 months, the city walls were breached, and Tyre fell. Most of its citizens were killed or enslaved. Alexander continued to Egypt, where the Persian governor surrendered the entire province. At Memphis, priests of this ancient land welcomed Alexander as their liberator from Persian rule and crowned him pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria, then traveled to the desert oracle of Siwa, where, according to some accounts, the priests welcomed him as son of Amun, king of the gods. He received a letter from the Persian king, offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace. But Alexander's stunning victories, all the oracles and acclamations, had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the world. He rejected the Persian king's offer. He didn't want half the empire. He was coming to take it all. A great Persian army, led by Darius, had assembled at Gaugamela. This was Darius's last chance to stop Alexander, and Alexander's chance to smash Persian power once and for all. Darius had chosen to fight on open ground, where his advantage in numbers would be more telling. His soldiers had also worked hard to clear and flatten the terrain, to make it suitable for Persian-scythed chariots. By modern estimates, the Persian army was between 50 and 80,000 strong. Alexander may have been outnumbered by as much as 2 to 1. The battle began when Alexander led his wing out to the right, a move that took the Persians by surprise. The Persians mirrored his movement, taking troops away from their center to outflank Alexander. But Alexander's unusual maneuver was a trap, to entice the Persians to weaken their center. When he saw that it had worked, he ordered his Greek cavalry to charge, to keep the Persians fixed in position. Darius, meanwhile, judging this to be the decisive moment, unleashed his chariots. But expert Agriones javelin throwers took out horses and crews, while the Greek infantry opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Now, Alexander led his companion cavalry and parts of the Macedonian phalanx in a headlong charge straight at the weakened Persian center, fighting his way towards Darius himself. The sudden ferocity of Alexander's assault threw the Persians into panic. The center of the army broke and ran, King Darius himself leading the rout. But Alexander's left wing was in serious trouble. Parmenion, facing a huge onslaught by Persian cavalry, was virtually surrounded. Parmenion sent a desperate appeal to Alexander for help. The king abandoned his pursuit of Darius, regrouped, and charged the Persian right wing. It was the hardest and bloodiest fighting of the battle. Finally, as news of Darius's flight spread across the battlefield, the last Persian horseman turned and fled. The Battle of Gaugamela was a stunning and complete victory for Alexander. The road to Babylon, the empire's main capital, lay open. The Macedonian king entered the great city in triumph, recognized by Persian officials as its new, rightful ruler. So too at the city of Susa, where Alexander ceremonially took his seat upon the royal throne of Persia. In early 330 BC, Alexander reached Persepolis, the empire's ceremonial capital. Alexander wanted to appear as a liberator to the Persians, as a legitimate successor to King Darius. But now, he ordered Persepolis to be pillaged and burnt. Retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece and the burning of Athens' sacred temples in 480 BC. Alexander now headed north into Media, where Darius had taken refuge in the royal city of Ecbatana. Alexander was determined to capture Darius, but the fugitive king fled east in the hope of raising a new army. It was not to be. As Alexander closed in, the Persian king was murdered by one of his own governors, Bessus, who then proclaimed himself the empire's new ruler. Alexander gave orders for Darius to be buried in the royal tombs of Persepolis, alongside his ancestors. Then he paused to organize his vast new empire. His goal next: to find and kill the usurper Bessus, subjugate the empire's eastern provinces, and reach the far edge of the world. To be continued.